In January of this year, I called my buddy Scott the Miniature Maniac because I had recently come into a Dark Eldar army, unbuilt, unpainted, but I knew he had the same, and we decided on a little challenge. Over the course of this year, in tandem, we were going to build up these armies so that they were ready for the tabletop. Scott, I saw your Razor Wing jet fighter. It was pretty cool. It was really cool, but I don't think you know what you've gotten yourself into. 2,000 points of Dark Eldar is a lot, and come December, we're gaming. With that said though, I'm also falling behind. 2,000 points of Dark Eldar is a lot of models, and I have completed 10 squads, which equals 855 points. I am barely knocking on the door of 1,000 points, but I'm getting there. I am getting back on the Dark Eldar horse, and I got Lelith. I definitely front-loaded my year building a lot of cheap infantry and transports, but now it is time to bump those numbers up, building some characters and elite units like Lelith Hesperex. Although she's not even that expensive. In game, she's 85 points. Pretty cheap. This is the new-ish model for Lelith Hesperex, and when it came out, there was a lot of moaning online that this sculpt wasn't hot enough to be the real Lelith, and that the old model was superior. Now, I don't think that anybody who said that actually owned the old model, because it was a tiny, crunchy, fine-cast mess, only saved by the unachievably perfect paint job on the web store. I like the new model just fine. Lelith Hesperex is the greatest gladiator in all of Camarog, and she is the succubus of the witch cult of Strife. She is the greatest warrior in the Dark Eldar, probably the Eldar. Now, 40k is full of characters who are the greatest fighter to ever fight a fight, but I think Lelith, it's probably true with Lelith, but she also probably picks her battles very strategically. She will never go up against like Angron, although her greatest wish is to kill Lucius the Eternal. I mean, a lot of people's greatest wish to kill Lucius the Eternal, but she's probably the one that's gonna do it. Now, I'm pretty happy with the Lelith Hesperex kit. There's just a couple of little things I would like to change, and a few big ones. One of the big ones is there's a giant like fence post sitting on one of her shoulder pads. Gonna have to get rid of that. And I don't like her, there's one little flaw with her pose. I like the one hand that's like acrobatically swinging off to the side with her dagger, but the other hand is like a Jason Voorhees holding the machete grip, just doing one of these. Gonna have to figure out something to do with that, and I have a little bit of kit bashing fodder. I've got the Daughters of Cain Underworld's Warband, so hopefully I can slice something off one of these, and then I'll have a really unique character. One of the little changes I want to make is losing some of her armor. Lelith has never taken so much as a scratch in combat, so she doesn't wear much in the way of bulky armor. She doesn't need it, and it's a way to taunt her enemies. I carefully use my hobby knife to carve away the plate armor on her thighs, then I sanded them smooth with a nail file. All of this cutting and filing left behind a gritty texture and some plastic fuzziness that I erased using the wet brush of my plastic glue. This instantly melts all the little imperfections and got her thighs perfectly smooth. Lelith comes in a bunch of awkward parts, and I can't put her all the way together until I've made all these little edits. On her front, I carved off a bit more of her shirt. This was trickier than her thighs. I had to remove the shirt and then re-sculpt her six-pack. The X-Acto got me most of the way there, and rubbing her tum-tum with plastic glue did a good job of softening and smoothing the plastic. Now to remove some more armor. I found where her neck fence shield thing sits, and I cut that off. She doesn't need the protection, and I sanded it smooth and knocked off the rivets. Rivets always imply something of a ramshackle construction, and Lelith's armor is probably the finest crafted witch suit in history. With all this cutting I'm doing, I introduced some gaps into the sculpt, and I filled these using Tamiya Basic Putty. This stuff can be thinned with plastic glue, which is perfect. I can glob it on, squishing it into the cracks, and then come back over top with my plastic glue, which will smooth it out. After a few minutes, it's dry enough to sand, and I can blast it with my sanding twig and get a perfect finish. I filled in the gap on her shoulder too, and I can finally assemble the model, filling in a few more little gaps. This is one of the smallest models I have done this much converting to. The last thing is her hair, but I don't want to glue it on just yet. I gotta get the armor figured out. I don't like that the blade isn't really pointing where she's looking. It makes her feel unbalanced. Looking at the arm, I think I can make it work with just a little repositioning of the blade. Also, I don't like the barbed wire wrapped around her bicep. Lelith famously doesn't use the combat drugs and pain stimulants typical of Dark Eldar. Her power is all natural, so I don't like this detail. I drilled a tiny hole in her arm just wide enough for a sewing pin, and then I drilled the same size into her wrist. She's so tiny, even with plastic glue, this connection would be too fragile without some reinforcements. Now that I have 360 degrees of posability on this hand, I think two poses look good. Her blade right up against her face, or 180 degrees out matching the movement of her hair. I like the out a little bit more. It makes the pose more open, and I like that her blades are in line with one another. Now for her crazy hair. I glued it on with plastic glue and then used some more Tamiya to fill in the big seam underneath. Her big hairdo is really nice. It makes a circle that frames the model nicely. It's like Squidmar's thumbnails, it's artistic. Yeah, knocking down some of the tactical parts of her armor and then twisting her arm just a little bit so that her blade flows into the circular pattern that makes up her crazy hairdo helped a ton. Now I gotta get this sucker on a base, and I kinda wish she stood on a 40mm base because her hair is humongous, and I don't really like it when models extend past the parameters of their base, but she is on a 32, and I don't have any 32mm bases because I do custom resin casted bases for all of my Dark Eldar, and I haven't made 32s yet. But I'm pretty sure I can fudge it. And also I think I can do some fun storytelling with that base to go in line with the story of this army. On the base she comes with, there's a long dead Eldar, and this gives me a fun idea. I also want a dead guy, but not an Eldar. I want a Scott. I have a collection of cast bases that didn't come out quite right. I can cut these up to make my new 32mm base. I stuck down one of my 28.5mm bases to a 32mm magnet sticker and then started filling it out with some chunks of other bases. Some of these never got enough resin to fill them up, so they're kinda hollow, which is perfect for cutting and using some milliput to smooth out the gaps. I cut off a big honkin' rock and glued this to the base, mirroring the little bit of Eldar building that the original Lelith model is jumping off of, and I used tons of super glue and baking soda to set this in place. Then I carefully cut away the chunks of building, leaving behind her toe and just a little bit of ground her toe is touching. I drilled a hole big enough for this plastic chunk and then filled it in with milliput and squished her foot down into the putty. I used some more milliput to sculpt the rock so that there's some smooth transitions between the different rocky outcroppings, and I left enough room for my dead Scott. To do this, I used one of the crew members from the Raider kit. These guys hang off the sides, which gives them very open poses, which help them look more dead. I had to carve into one of his butt cheeks to get a little more posability out of his leg. Viewer discretion is advised. I smoothed out the milliput with some water and I found a right arm for Scott. Then I used a head from the Reaver jet bike box. This is Scott's favorite Drukhari head, so it seemed appropriate. I used some more Tamiya putty to perfect the rocks, and I sprinkled on some fine-grained slate rock, locking it down with some ultra-thin superglue. Taking another look, I thought Scott didn't look dead enough, so I carefully gave him some more slashes across the front with my hobby knife. Now, Lelith is built and ready to go. I've got the warlord of my army, Lelith Hesperex, done, and now I've got a little storytelling going on to show the model's provenance. The reason I'm doing this army is the friendly competition I have with Scott. Now to paint this sucker, I've actually never painted Drukhari's skin. All of my Kabalite warriors are covered head to toe in armor, and my racks don't wear skin, so I gotta make some decisions. I primed Lily in black and then sprayed some indigo blue ink from below to make my blacks extra black. Then I zenithal the mini with a white ink from above. Then a dusting of some phthalo cyan green, which is an emerald green color, which reinforces my shadows. Now for that skin. I have no idea what I'm doing. I found a light purple color and I started off with this, glazing it on over the skin and tinted it into a cold purple. This is a decent start on a classic gray Dark Eldar skin, but I don't think that's actually what I want. For her clothing and armor, I'm thinking green, and a more saturated orangey skin would look more striking. I thinned down some Reikland flesh shade and I put this over the skin, doing 2 coats to get her skin nice and warm with dark shadows. Then I started glazing on a light beige red color, doing many thin layers to get smooth transitions from my orangey base coat up to almost pure white. This took a lot of work, but Lily is a really small model, so it didn't take too long to get all these layers down. On her face, I painted her eyes, base coating them with a really dark brown and then putting the whites into her eyes with a warm white. I wanted to try using these colors to see if they would give her softer, less striking eyes than my normal black and white, and I think it worked well. Lelith has a tattoo or makeup of 3 blood drops coming out of her left eye and some blue eyeliner, and I tried to give her some red lipstick. I've tried to paint red lips on models and it's always a huge struggle. Her head is smaller than the head of a pin. Now for her clothing. For the armor, I'm going with Black Templar, and the fabric, I'm using Eldari Emerald, mixed with just a little drop of neon green to make it more saturated. I glazed the green on all her cloth parts and black over all the hard armor. Then I started highlighting, using a green-white on her clothing, pretty much treating everything like non-metallic metal. And speaking of non-metallic metal, I did NNM on all the armor, using warm grays to do these highlights on her shoulders and weapons. She's getting close to done now. The next step is the hair. I used transparent red ink on her hair. This transparent color will let the zenithal prime show through and give me some contrast. This worked, but it didn't give me as much vibrancy as I wanted, so I used my airbrush to give a poof of white on the top of her hair and then another 2 coats of red. I did a few edge highlights of warm white and the hair was done. I have finished my first ever witch, and I kinda wanna paint a bunch more because they're a weird little unit. It's just a bunch of toughness 3, 6-up save models that can kind of accidentally punch really good in close combat. Their blades are all strength 3, but attached to Lelith and with a pain token, they're AP -3. So all of a sudden, these little nothing worse than guardsman models are really doing some work. It is super interesting, almost as interesting as our website. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch, like our new Nick and Jay dice, and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain pack or any previous pack we have ever made. This month, we here at Eons of Battle are proud to announce the Whimsical Cottages. Fantasy buildings perfect for any game with a ye olde flair. Move your models around the quaint homes, the roomy houses, or set up shop with the tavern. With this terrain, you can make an entire town, complete with pumpkins, giant mushrooms, and trees to really fill out a game board. Now, I'm in a bit of a conundrum with witches. I have Lelith, but I really don't like the Games Workshop witches. I don't want to put them together. I don't want to paint them. I want to use something else. I don't know what that something else is, whether it's like a 3D printed proxy. I've been thinking about the Daughters of Cain models, but they're gonna be tricky to convert, and they also have big giant hair, so I'd have to head swap them all because my witches can't have cooler hair than Lelith, at least not bigger hair. And so I don't know exactly what I'm gonna do. And the Dark Eldar are kind of in a rough spot in terms of Warhammer 40k. There's a bunch of armies that are getting range refreshes, but the Dark Eldar kind of just need a range. Dark Eldar right now have a ton of units that have rules, but they don't have miniatures right now. We don't have Urian Rakarth, Beastmasters, Court of the Archon, Grotesques, and the models that we do have are some of the oldest in the 40k range. So I'm really hoping that Games Workshop is going to update the Dark Eldar sometime soon, and my dream would be they update the witches. I'm even fine with the Cabalites. I think the Cabalites still hold up great, but the witches, and all those things I mentioned, they need some help. But speaking of needing some help, the Scott Cabalite Warrior needs some help, and I don't think he's gonna get any. I'm gonna paint this guy up in Scott's color scheme. He had a video where he showed exactly how I did this, but I don't feel like hunting that video down, so I'm gonna make it up. I started out base coating the mini with a mid-tone brown and then zenithalled him with a tan paint. Then I sprayed some satin varnish to make the model nice and smooth for the next step. Noosh. I made up a noosh mix of some dark brown and I slobbered this all over the mini, wiping it away with a makeup sponge, which left it behind in the recesses. Then I edge highlighted everything with an off-white. One of Scott's accent colors is yellow, so I picked a few parts of his armor pieces to be yellow, giving these a shade and an edge highlight as well. And I used black Templar contrast paint on all the cloth parts, and a little bit of blue, light blue on his tubes and buttons. Now for that head, and I remember Scott used Maltau Chrome. I actually have one of these pens, but mine is 5 or 6 years old, and after a Herculean amount of shaking and fussing, I could not get it back, so I gave up and I used my shiniest silver paint. Maybe when I visit Scott this December, I can borrow his pen to touch this up, although I don't know how receptive he'll be to helping me essentially troll him. I glued Scott down to the base, and the warmth of Scott's color scheme looks really good alongside all the saturated cold tones of my minion base. I finished this up with a healthy splattering of Blood for the Blood God technical paint, making a big pool under Scott and spreading this onto Lilith's weapons and daggers. She's killed one of Scott's Cabalites, and she's gonna kill a lot more. The dead Scott Drukhari looks so good! It's really hard to get like a dead model to look convincing on a base because you need that like ragdoll effect and models are very rigid, but I think this pulls it off really well. I'm gonna text Scott a picture right now. With Lilith Hesperex done, my army now has a warlord and I am one miniature closer to a full 2,000 points of Drukhari. Next up on the painting bench probably should be witches, but I got a hard decision to make. Do I make do with the Games Workshop minis? Do I get some Daughters of Cain models and try to kit bash and convert those into something I like? Or do I hold out hope that Games Workshop is gonna drop some brand new Drukhari miniatures? Probably not. They haven't even teased any Drukhari on the horizon, but I don't know what I'm gonna do. But I do know what I am gonna do. Come this December, me and my Drukhari army are coming for Scott the Miniature Maniac.